The US Commerce Secretary has said a recession would be worth it to get President Trump's policies in place. But is that likely to happen? This is Macro Matters, and we're talking recession fears. A US slowdown looked unlikely at the start of the year, but now it's back in the conversation as the uncertainty around tariffs has shaken stock markets and made consumers nervous. Gregory Daco is chief economist at EY. Gregory, is there yet any hard data that makes you think the recession risk has risen?
No, I don't think we've seen any evidence in the hard data that a recession is imminent. What we've seen, however, is the fact that there is a significant rise in uncertainty. Policy uncertainty is at all-time highs, and that is feeding directly into consumer sentiment and business sentiment, which generally is a leading indicator of how both consumers and businesses will spend and invest. So the fear is that there is actually a pullback to come as a result of this rise in uncertainty.
In other words, do you think the uncertainty around tariffs could hit business investment and consumer spending in a way that would make a significant difference, even if the tariffs themselves don't increase costs that much?
Well, I think it's going to be a 1-2 punch in terms of the effect on the private sector. The first effect is going to be this rise in uncertainty that leads to a wait-and-see approach from consumers and businesses when it comes to spending decisions, investment decisions, and even hiring decisions. And that will lead to a slowdown in employment growth, income growth, and in turn lead to further reductions in consumer spending and business investment activity. When the tariffs are implemented, that will lead to heightened inflationary pressures that will be demand destructive, and that's another shock that will likely weigh on the US economy.
Does that mean you see potentially the prospect of lower growth and higher inflation, that spectre of stagflation?
That's the fear. The fear of stagflation is one that we're all extremely worried about because we have an environment where you could potentially see something that we haven't seen in about 50 years, an environment where higher inflation is generated by the tariffs and by this massive supply side shock, at the same time as we're seeing demand destruction resulting from higher prices and still high interest rates. I would note that in this environment, policy uncertainty could very well filter onto financial markets and lead to heightened financial market volatility with downward pressure on stock prices, which could affect both business investment and consumer spending, because a larger share of consumer spending is driven by wealthier individuals that rely in part on wealth as a driving factor.
You mentioned the impact on the labour market, Gregory. What about the possible consequences of lower immigration and maybe even large-scale deportations, which the Trump administration still says it aims to carry out?
Yeah, we don't know much about what the future of immigration policy really holds, but an environment in which we would see reduced immigration flows, which is something that we've already started to see over the course of the past 3-4 months, would weigh on labor force growth, would weigh likely on employment, and could lead to some emerging wage pressures, especially in sectors that are the most dependent on immigration. You can think of construction, you can think of healthcare, you can think of retail and leisure as prime sectors where we could start to see the reemergence of wage growth pressures. And we know that in an environment where wage growth is accelerating, that tends to lead to higher inflation, something that the Fed does not want to be seeing at this point.
We're also seeing major cuts to the federal government workforce and spending. Are these on a large enough scale to make a difference across the economy?
Not in the near term. We're in an environment where we've started to see some cuts at the federal government level, some contracts being discontinued, and some federal workers being laid off. But if we think about the grand scheme of all of these cuts, they're not significant enough to really lead to a major pullback in economic activity. Even if we take the extreme of 200,000 workers over the course of a year, that's just the equivalent of 1 month of job gains, which is not enough to put the economy into an economic contraction or a potential recession. The risk here is that there is a knock-on effect to private sector activity and to confidence that could lead to a much broader pullback in economic activity.
That was Gregory Daco of EY Parthenon. Don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.